Hello and good evening. My name is Sharon Loudon, and I am here to introduce Dr. Joe Stahlman, who is the director of the Seneca Nation's Seneca-Iroquois National Museum-Onöhsagwë Culture Center. And Joe is here with us as a part of the Chautauqua lecture series. I'm particularly thrilled to have Joe with us this evening, as the Cultural Center, Onöhsagwë Cultural Center, is our neighbor, is Chautauqua's neighbor. And the museum is spectacular, and I recommend to everyone to please visit. Joe is a scholar and researcher of the Tuscarora and researcher of the Tuscarora descent. He has over 20 years of research experience working with First Peoples. His research focuses on culture and history, as well as ongoing role in addressing the space Native peoples occupies in Native American Archaeology and Cultural Resource Society through a number of reconciliatory processes, which are all inclusive for all and empower people to express agency through creative and intellectual endeavors. I think I sort of messed that up. I also want to just share a sentence that I forgot to mention here or didn't say initially. In addition to culture and history, he also researches on socioeconomic and health and wellness related endeavors with Native communities. Joe is really wonderful. He's a wonderful neighbor and cares so much about Native communities, especially in where Seneca-Iroquois Nation exists in New York State. So without further ado, I would love to bring Joe on. And then after Joe's lecture, please stay for our question and answer period, where we would love to field any questions you might have for Joe. Thank you so much. Joe, it's lovely seeing you here.
Thank you, Sharon.
I think we lost Joe here. I think I messed up there. There we go.
I'll start over. Twe Eskenehe, Yate Dr. Joe Stahlman. What I said in Tuscarora is, hello, are you at peace? I'm at peace. My name is Dr. Joe Stahlman. Thank you for inviting me here this evening. Where is the okay. Pardon me, it will probably take me a few minutes where I'll fumble around until I get used to all the buttons. So please, I'm still online presentations. So today I will be talking about the Seneca Nation. The reason why I want to talk about the Seneca Nation is because for a lot of people in Southern New York or Western New York, they are unaware that they have Native American neighbors living in their own neck of the woods. And the people who live in Southern New York and Western New York are predominantly members of the Seneca Nation, which is a very large tribe of Iroquoian or Haudenosaunee Native Americans. Before I begin, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that the campus of the Institute is situated within the traditional territory of the Onondaga, the Seneca Nation, and their ancestors, the Neutral, the Erie, and the Renro. It is our sincere and perpetual respect for the treaties that were made on these territories, and we wholeheartedly pledge to work in partnership in the spirit of collaboration with our current neighbors. Yahweh. So a little bit about myself. Sharon gave you an intro about myself. I am of Tuscarora descent. I have to say descent because my father was an enrolled Tuscarora and my mother was not. And so as a result, with any Iroquoian community, all descent and enrollment falls on the mother. So in my case, because my father is Native, I cannot be enrolled. I am just considered to be a descendant. As a result of being mixed race, I grew up in a family situation where a lot of people would place me into their own categories, and that caused a lot of confusion in my own life. And so as I got older, I became interested in literatures on Native Americans. So that encompassed everything from ethnologies to ethnographies to histories to art books and anything that involved Native Americans. And so as a result, when it was time for me to go to college, I already knew what I wanted to do, and that was to be an anthropologist. And not so much an anthropologist to go study other people, but to use the tools in the toolbox of anthropology to help my own community. And so as a result of that, I have earned a PhD in social cultural anthropology. And if you were to look at my CV, you would see that I actually have 4 degrees in social cultural anthropology. And for each one of those degrees in anthropology, I explored a different way to study Native populations. So in my first master's, what I did is I went to southern Mexico and I lived in a multicultural community of 7 ethnic groups. And I studied how people were changing, how HIV and AIDS went from a biomedical disease into a folk illness, and how that folk illness really was encapsulated within each of the 7 cultural communities. That was very interesting. For my second degree, I worked in Honduras, where I worked with a community of Native people who no longer possessed any cultural practices or religion. However, they carried on a pottery tradition that predated any arrival of Europeans. And so these people expressed their nativeness through their potteries, and that was very interesting. And then finally, for my PhD, what I did was I focused on a Tuscarora worldview, where I was looking at a seemingly disparate community where you had people who belonged to a Christian community, to a Baptist community, to a Catholic community, and to a traditional Tuscarora religious community. And by spending time with all of these different groups in the community, what I learned was, although everyone is different, they were held together by the same cultural package and thinking and wiring that we assumed that they would. Because a lot of times in anthropology, I have found myself encountered in situations where the anthropologist, the expert, comes into a situation and declares a certain ethnic group not to be complete, legitimate, authentic, traditional, based on certain criteria that they thought to be important and imposed on those cultures. And so for me, what I like to do is I like to go into these communities of interest and then pull out all the expressions of culture and show it to the audiences. And that's been very successful. I really like it. One, it shows those communities as present day living beings who are not stuck in the past, because one of the stereotypes about Native Americans is we're people of the past. We don't live in the present. And that's one of the things that I do in my job day to day, is to make sure that everyone understands that Native peoples are around you every day, and they occupy the same spaces, and they have the same things that they care about as you. However, they might express it a little differently. So, upon graduating with my PhD, one of the first things that I thought I wanted to do was to be a teacher. And I wasn't wrong about that. But what I think where I was wrong was trying to go from academia right into another academic job. And that just wasn't working for me. I graduated post 2008. And so as a result, academia really changed in that time. Tenure track jobs went away. And then the field just started filling up with adjuncts. And I didn't want to adjunct. I didn't want to move town to town and become a visiting professor each year and not have any job security. And I had 2 children who were still in high school at the time. So I made a choice at that moment to stay situated and forgo any academic dreams so my children could graduate from high school and move on to college, and so they could pursue their lives. And so as a non-traditional move, what I did was I packed up from Indiana and moved back to New York State, where I'm from, and I just started knocking on doors. And one of the doors I started knocking on was Seneca Nation. They gave me a contract. I successfully completed that contract. They gave me some more, and I started to meet people, and before you know it, I had a job. And the job that I currently hold for them, as Sharon mentioned earlier, is that I am the Seneca Nation Director for the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum, also known as the Unöhsagwë Cultural Center. Unöhsagwë is a Onondaga word or Seneca word that means open at both ends, which is actually a very nice way to invite people into your homes, because your hearth is everyone's hearth. And so that's how we kind of come to think about our museum and cultural center. Another thing I do with Seneca Nation is I am their TIPO officer, or TIPO director. And TIPO is, the T is for tribal, H is for historic, P is for preservation, and O is for office. And so this job falls in line with your state SHPOs who are interested in historic properties and cultural resources. Well, I do the same thing, but I only focus on Seneca related or Haudenosaunee. So throughout this presentation today, I will use a word called Haudenosaunee, and that is the word that we refer to ourselves. A lot of people in the world know us as the Iroquois, but we would like to call ourselves the Haudenosaunee, and that means people of the Longhouse. And for us, the Longhouse is actually a very long home where everyone who was blood related would live in by clan. But it's also a metaphor where we open our doors and invite everyone in to make a larger family. Another thing that I would like to talk about in tonight's talk is COVID-19. As we all know, that COVID has really taken us down very different directions than where we thought we would be right now. And as a result of being a director of a regional Native American museum, that has taken me down some very unexpected paths. And I would like to try to flesh that out a little bit in this presentation, okay? And then for 21-22, I have a couple exhibits that we have in the works. One, I want to focus on Haudenosaunee beadwork. Haudenosaunee peoples are known for their beadwork. And so next September 28th through the 30th, we are scheduled to have a Haudenosaunee beadwork conference at Seneca Nation in Salamanca, New York. And along with that conference, we are organizing an exhibit to focus on 200 years of Haudenosaunee beadwork. Another thing that we're working on is on protest. One thing, if you guys don't know, all Haudenosaunee peoples, especially the Onondaga, they are known for their protesting. So if they don't like something, they will definitely be out in the streets holding signs, picketing, doing whatever they can to change the public opinion about certain things. So as an anthropologist, I hope everyone at home can see this map. So I like to use this map. This map is the spiritual landscape of the Ojibwa people, or the Anishinaabe people, or the Great Lakes people. And I use this image because I simply want to use a still image to prove to everyone in the world that even though the United States of America is this world that professes to be this melting pot where everyone comes in and becomes this American, well, I use this image to prove to the world that we continue to see the world in vastly different ways. So for those at home, if you can tell by looking at this image, we're actually looking at the Great Lakes. And we're not using the north as our upward motion, we're using east. For Native peoples, the most sacred direction is east, so that is our northing. And then every landmark and village site on the map are very relevant to Anishinaabe people, but also in the eastern part of the lakes, also to Haudenosaunee folks. But I think it's a very useful way to show how we continue to be different from everyone else. So who are the Seneca? The Seneca Nation, also known as the Onondaga, they're one of the 6 communities of the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee. And the Iroquois comprises of 6 sovereign nations, one being the Seneca, and they are the guardians of the Western Door. And then after the Seneca, you have the Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, the keepers of the Eastern Door, and then in 1722, the Tuscarora, who I'm part of, came up north from North Carolina and resettled among the Haudenosaunee in Pennsylvania and New York State. And so the Seneca, throughout recorded history, so in 1587, they were located on the eastern shore of Canandaigua Lake. That is their spiritual homeland, at a place called Bear Hill. And from this mythical, magical place sprung the first Onondaga peoples. And since that time, they slowly filled up the western part of the Finger Lakes. However, after French explorers came into the area, we quickly see the Onondaga spread from the western Finger Lakes all the way across the Great Lakes through Ontario, down through Ohio, Indiana, all the way to the river, and then along in the south, Kentucky, the Smoky Mountains, and then back to the east to the Appalachians, and back up into New York and Pennsylvania. So in about 120 years, this nation of First Peoples conquered almost a third of the United States. And they did so to control the beaver trade, because they got into partnerships with the British and the French and the Dutch. And so there was this trade exchange, and the Seneca, to make the most out of it, conquered about a third of what is now the United States. After the American Revolution, things really began to change for the Seneca. They lost that power status that they had. They lost that dominion over the Ohio River Valley, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. So that was all in the domain of the Seneca. But by the end of the American Revolution, they were basically reduced to the top part of Ohio, going into Erie, PA, going back to the Finger Lakes, and then going south. They followed the Allegheny River down through Pittsburgh, basically to the West Virginia state line today. So by the end of the American Revolution, they lost a great tract of their land. And then even in another 10 years, by 1794, they were basically reduced to Western Pennsylvania and Western New York. And then by 1826, they were reduced even further to 10 territories, stemming from Canandaigua Lake to the New York State border, where it touches Pennsylvania by Erie. And then even more, by 1832, the Seneca were reduced to 3 territories in New York State. Allegheny, that's where Salamanca is, And then up north along the southern coast of Lake Erie, they continue to have a land there. And then another Seneca group left them and have established their own reserve on a place called Tonawanda along the southern shore of Lake Ontario in Genesee County. So that's basically the Seneca at the end of the 1850s. But, you know, from the 1830s until the 1990s, the Seneca have faced increasing pressures from the American government. First, it was the Erie Canal, and then it became railroads, and then it became roads, and then it became Christians, and then it became assimilationist. For instance, Richard Pratt, whom many of you know, was the director of the Carlisle Indian School in the 19th century. He was responsible for assimilating hundreds of Haudenosaunee children into white culture. So, you know, as we march through history, we see a lot of pressures on the Seneca and other Haudenosaunee peoples to assimilate. Within my own community, my great-grandmother is a survivor of Carlisle. And from what I know from my older living relatives is that my grandmother did not want to talk about Carlisle. It was a very traumatic experience. And I am sure this is the case for many people who went to Carlisle, especially afterward, because when people left these boarding schools afterward, a common narrative that you see in the literature is how those young people didn't fit in anywhere. They didn't fit in white America because they were obviously not white. And then within their own communities, they were seen as white. And so we have a lot of people who lived in a liminal state for a long time because of these types of practices. And just to hurry us through history just a little bit, not saying that it's not important because it is, but up through time. So in the 60s, we have the Kinzua Dam. So for those who go to Chautauqua often, you will see the Kinzua Dam. It is a prominent feature in this part of New York State. Well, the United States broke a very important treaty of 1794 and made a law and took it upon themselves to impose this law on the Seneca. And they use eminent domain, and they basically condemned about 26 miles of very limited Seneca territory and created a body of water so Pittsburgh would not flood. Since Kinzua, there's been 2 highways that have gone through Seneca territory. In the south, we have I-86. I-86 took approximately 10.1 miles of additional Seneca territory, which is very valuable. Up north, Ragas territory, I-90 approximately took the same amount of territory. So these reductions of territories really do affect Native nations because they already have a limited land base to begin with anyways. So what do I do for Seneca Nation? So I'm going to break this down into 3 parts. One, I am the Cultural Center Director. As Sharon knows, it is pronounced the Unöhsagwë Cultural Center. I am also the museum director of the museum, which is inside the Cultural Center. And then, like I said a little bit before, I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. And at this point, I want you all to focus on the slide because these 3 roles, although they're occupied by one person, they are actually very and vastly different in my day-to-day. So in one moment, I could be the TIPO guy, and the next minute after I get off that phone call, there could be someone at my door needing to talk about something at the museum. So I got to switch those hats real quick, and I have gotten used to it, actually. So this is the Unöhsagwë Cultural Center. It's located in Salamanca, New York. It was built in 2018 for approximately $16 million. The reason why there's so much money invested in this is because, first of all, the facility is 32,000 square feet. We have 3 separate HVAC systems, one for our collections, one for downstairs, and one for upstairs. So If anything fails, we got backups. Everything is climate controlled. We have our own facility inside to conserve our own objects, to do workshops. With the cultural center, though, I do a lot of public outreach. I bridge the Seneca to the larger world, and I do my best to bring the larger world to Seneca Nation. When you run something like a cultural center, you are the face of the nation, if you like it or not. Even though I'm Tuscarora, I have to put on a Seneca face. I do not ever claim that I'm Seneca, and I'm always quick to make sure that everyone knows that I am not Seneca, but Tuscarora. And so remember, being Tuscarora and Seneca, they're sister nations. So a lot of the cultural practices within the Tuscarora are the same as they are going to be for the Seneca or the Cayuga or Mohawks. So, one song in our territory is the same song for the Seneca. So a lot of crossover. We do a lot of promotion of local arts and crafts. And in my last 2 years in this role, I have been trying to promote Seneca artisans out of that art and crafts phase, because what a lot of non-natives, what they don't know is that these people are so good at what they do, they need to have more eyes on them, and they need to have some attention. And I think there's also a lot of room where non-natives who are interested in native art forms can actually learn a lot from these folks that I've been spending a lot of time with. What else do I do? We do a lot of arts classes. So we'll teach people how to make medicine bags, how to make corn husk dolls, how to make hand drums. We invite locals and regional and even nationally known scholars and researchers on Seneca or Haudenosaunee folks to come and give talks. Every year we do a fall and spring speaker series. It's very well attended. This year it just didn't happen. Just couldn't make it work. Because the Seneca Nation is also a sovereign nation. All native nations are considered to be distinctive from the United States, even though the United States imposes this plenary control over native communities. It's still a contentious and difficult thing to talk about with federal officials. But as a result, the nation is a sovereign, and as a result, there are always dignitaries that come to the nation. These dignitaries can be government officials, royalty, investors, just people with maybe a lot of money who come to the nation to gamble, and they meet someone, and before you know it, I have to give them a tour of the facility. And I love doing it. I meet tons of people every day. And then we do a lot of support with researchers. So one of the things as an anthropologist, as a native anthropologist, that I try to do is that I try to get social scientists and humanities researchers out of the books and talking to living people. That's been one of my disappointments as a native person working my way through academia as a student and later as a professor, is that a lot of my colleagues don't speak with living people. It's so imperative. If you want real quality research, get out of the books. Use the books just for your background, for your structure, and then go speak to real people, because that's going to change everything that you feel about your research. And I can always tell the difference between people who go into the community and become part of that community and those who just do all their works in the library. There's a difference. And so one of my goals for the first 5 years is to turn the Cultural Center into a research repository. And so far, Cornell University have given their archaeological collections to our museum. We have accumulated a couple others over time. And then most recently, we have been working with a state museum to get back a very important archaeological site that involved the Seneca back in the 17th century. And so the goal by bringing all this material to us is to force people out of the libraries of life and to us to come and see us. So the museum, like I said, we do regular exhibits. We usually do 2 short-term, less than 6 months, and 1 long-term over the course of a year. Last year, we were able to do 2 long-term ones at 6 months apiece. That worked out really well. However, we quickly learned that a 6 months long-term exhibit isn't long enough for locals to come and see. Within our collections, we have over 100,000 items, and these items include art, and anything that you think of art, contemporary, like painting, metallurgy, woodworking, whatever you can think of as an art form, we do it and we collect it. Our collection also has an ethnographic collection, an archaeological collection, and then we actually have some things that defy any category, some things that have been found over time, and it leaves us scratching our heads. What was this object? What did they use it for? And what was it called? When you see something that you've never seen before, it causes a lot of excitement. It gives us a different view into the past and how our ancestors lived, and yeah, it just opens up a whole new thing. So we try to add to our collections every year. I have to admit, my budget for buying for our collections has been greatly reduced, but there is some funding in there this year to buy several nice pieces. I have been looking at a couple objects right now that I'm interested in bringing into the museum. We try to focus on Seneca mostly, but we also do spread out to other Haudenosaunee. As I said many times, there are sister nations, and so a lot of their cultural expressions are much like ours. And so we also conserve our own objects. Some things we cannot do, and we'll probably never conserve certain types of objects. It would always kind of be out of our range, but we do what we can. And what we can't do, we look for in grants, or we reach out to universities with art conservation programs and try to get a few of our objects fixed throughout an academic year. And then we also have a library in the museum, and we have about, maybe about 1,500 books, mostly focused on the Seneca and Haudenosaunee, but that doesn't even include all the papers of where Northeastern natives have been discussed in the literature since 1492, right? So we just have copies and copies of narratives from French priests, the black robes who came down the St. Lawrence. We have travelers, fur trappers, government officials. We have letters written by George Washington talking to the Onondaga. So we really do have everything in our library. So in the museum, I kind of approach my work in a couple ways. Museums, I'm not really a museum director, and don't take that wrong. When I got my training, I worked in museums as a graduate student to pay the bills and to learn how non-native museums worked and how they discussed native peoples and their objects. So basically, I was using that anthropological toolbox to learn more about my colleagues and how the non-native world viewed native peoples. And so as a result, let's look at this pot right here. This is a small size pot. It is probably, 6-7 inches tall, 3 or 4 inches around, okay? And so when we look at the archaeological record, at least when I look at the archaeological record, I look at what the archaeologists said about the things that they dug up. And so a lot of times they would just call this a pot. And as a result of that, that interpretation of what that object is has filtered down into common parlance or common knowledge of us. That's a pot. It was made by Seneca people. And the reason why we think it's a pot, because of the collar, the shoulder, the neck, the body, the bottom, right? And we would look at that object and say, it's a pot. However, in my job, I like to focus on all the ways of knowing that I can incorporate into a thing. So I have to admit, I really thought that this small earthen vessel, this small fired earthen vessel was just a pot, right? And so, you know, we would talk to people, we would get input. And so for, you know, for most of my life, everybody was like, this is a small pot. It was probably used for making small meals. And the interpretations would grow and grow and grow. Like I said, it's a small pot, like 7 inches. And then we came across a narrative from a French priest. And he says their drums were earthen pots full of water covered with stag skin, that stick like hammers for that purpose. The elders have bombkins to the end of their stoves full of small stones, which make a rattle, to which young men and women go in cadence. The elders are about these pots, beating them and singing. The women also by having a nosegay in their hands and dance very modestly, not lifting their feet from the ground, keeping their heads downwards, making a sweet harmony. I can picture that dance because we do these social dances all the time. And that's what these people were doing when the priest, Radisson, was in this Seneca community. So this small pot, it turns out, was the precursor to our hand drum. And that's what these small pots are. They're not small pots for making food. They're someone's drum. And so for over 100 years, you have these archaeologists digging out pots out of the earth, not thinking that they're sacred, but in actuality, these small earthen pots are very sacred because with our hand drums, we perform everything from social songs to our death song, to life songs, to songs that part of life. And so what's really amazing about this little nugget of learning about this little nugget is, for the longest time, you see the image that you have here, all of us had assumed that Seneca people and all Haudenosaunee peoples have always used small wooden drums, because that is a wooden drum that's been carved out in the center, filled with water, and then the stag skin is put on top and then is beat upon. And the water level inside the pot or the drum will change the tone. And so for depending on the type of song you had to do, you can change the sound of your drum. But also learning this little fact, as a museum director and anthropologist, it really changes the way that we look at these objects. And it makes me, it constantly reminds me that I actually maybe don't know what I'm looking at. And I need to have an open mind, even after I have settled my mind and said, that's a drum or that's a pot, only to learn later down the road that is probably going to be something else. The museum also collects art, like I said. These are some very contemporary paintings. The one on the left is just a woman with a treaty belt. The treaty belt is a friendship belt. And then the elder behind her, more than likely a clan mother. The person on the right is Corn Planter. Corn Planter is one of the most famous chiefs ever of the Seneca. We do contemporary pots. These pots are made by Pete Jones, who is Seneca and Onondaga. This is Carson Waterman's artwork. He's a very interesting Seneca artist. He's in his mid 70s at this point, but he's always done these comic book style art, this comic book style of art revolving around Seneca and other Iroquois. And he was actually influenced by comic books. And when he went to art school in the 60s, his roommate at the time was actually Robert Crumb. So him and Robert had this influence on each other very early on in their art school career. And it evidently shows in Carson's work today. This is more of Carson's work. I love the way that he focuses on these people. He has a real knack for it. This is actually a moose antler carved. This moose antler was carved by Hayden Haynes, who's Wolf Clan. And Hayden's been doing this for about 12 years. He started off on soapstone. Basically, when Hayden was younger, he would come to the museum and just look at some of the carvings out of antler, horn, and stone. And he dared himself one day to try it, and he's been doing it ever since. He's really amazing, as you can tell by the detail of this wolf. And then if you look to the right of the wolf, those triangles going down are eagle feathers, and you will see all the detail in that if you were to scan in. This is another piece by Hayden. This is done on an elk antler. And what he did was carve one of our mythical heroes. So the first chief of any Iroquois community was Tatahoa. And Tatahoa was this ugly chief, and he had snakes in his hair, and he was all ratty and vicious and a cannibal. And over time, these three people came, the peacemaker, Hiawatha, and Jinko Sansei, came and persuaded this man to give up his evil ways and move on the path of peace. And so because of this story in our communities, it's actually the binding story for all 6 nations within the Confederacy of the Haudenosaunee. This chief, Tatahoa, becomes the first person to give up cannibalism for a path of peacefulness. And so we always remember him through our art, but we also name our main chief, Tatahoa, after him, so we will never forget the story. So another thing the museum does is, like I said, we buy art. And if you look at this piece, this is a leather pouch. And it's very traditional in the sense of the bag shape, the fringe, the length. What's not traditional are the beads. So the colors aren't traditional. Those colors are very contemporary. And I would say in the last 5 years, I have started to see lots and lots of colors like this pop up on Onondaga beadwork. So for me, and for anyone who comes after me, these beads are going to be indicative of a time period. And when I go into the museum collections, I can quickly look at the beadwork style, the color of beads, the size of the beads, and what objects they're on to quickly decipher when those were made. And so for this one, even though it's very contemporary, the colors are very loud, and the designs are very non-traditional Haudenosaunee, it's a very indicative style and is actually proven to be very popular among all ages in the Native community. So this piece is not at our museum. However, I had the privilege to judge a Haudenosaunee fine art show last week at the Ganonigan State Park. And this was one of the pieces that was a favorite amongst all the judges and panelists. What we have here is a traditional Seneca pendant. However, the beadworker beaded a Sasquatch. So that pendant in the center is probably like 5 or 6 inches big, and it's all beaded to look like Sasquatch. So those are tiny beads making that image. And then on the back of it, you see that bit of fur. The artist says that is actual Sasquatch fur. I have no idea. I don't know. I wasn't able to physically touch the object because it was a virtual exhibit. But here we are. And so even the ideas of what we conceive to be art or fine art is rapidly changing, especially in our community, because we have a traditional foundation, but we are also always incorporating elements from outside our communities, from Western art or even Western-based media. It all filters in. So this is one of my more favorite pieces here. Is actually it's been presented as art, even though it's very functional. So what we have here is a very formal outfit for a man. Yes, for a long time, all the Haudenosaunee in New York, the Northeast, we would wear breechcloths, or we would wear skirting. During the winter, we would wear leggings, but when it was seasonally appropriate, men would often go without anything on or wear a skirt. And so what we have here is a Mohawk artist who combined the best of the traditional world and throwing in a little bit of her own artistic flair. So we have the skirting, and along the skirting we have a sash. So Native men and women wear a lot of sashes, a lot of finger weaving. We do a lot of finger weaving in our communities. On the chest, you'll see what it looks like, a giant pendant. But what it actually is a knife and a knife case. And this object on the knife case, that yellow, white, and red that you see, is not actually beads this time. It is porcupine quills. And so we have people in our communities who will go out and gather porcupine quills, boil them for about 20 minutes, flatten them out, dye them with natural dyes, and then weave them. And before we had beads, because beads were brought here by Western Europeans, before we had beads, we either had shell beads or we used quill work to do our expression. And then to the left, at the top of the pedestal, we have a hat. Haudenosaunee peoples are well hats. Before the arrival of Europeans, we would wear turbans or we would wear gastoas. Gastoas are what we call our headdresses. They are not similar to what you are accustomed to seeing on the Great Plains. Our gastoas fit around our head, and then on top, they would just have like an explosion of feathers coming out of the top of your head, kind of like the hat that you see here. And then below, we have the moccasins. And we have a very traditional type of moccasins here. If you notice at the front of the moccasins, it looks like they're being squished in, but we call that puckering. And it is a very distinctive style of moccasin wear. So you can kind of tell what community, or at least what larger ethnic group someone comes from based on their moccasins. I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between a Mohawk moccasin from a Seneca moccasin unless I had the colors. And in this case, Seneca colors are usually red or black, but also Mohawk colors are red and black. So it becomes a little tricky, right? But, with an eye, you kind of get a feel of what's what. But I like this very much. This is very contemporary. This piece was also in the art show, and I just wanted to use it to show how our potters, our ceramicists, our incorporate all of those elements from our creation tales into our modern expressions. Because if you go back to the antler where Hayden is using the Tatahoa as an inspiration, Tashi here is actually using corn. Corn is one of the three primary sisters that gives us life, but the earth itself is our mother. And I don't mean that in just a metaphorical sense. Everything given to us is from the Mother Earth. And so she is our mother. She does sustain us. She gives us life. And she gives us everything that we need. Everything that when we're sick, we can go outside and find our medicines. When we're hungry, we can go find food. If we need lodging, clothing, and so on, it's all provided by Mother Earth. So what Tashi's doing here is using elements of Mother Earth, her own womanness, because we elevate womanhood in our community. We live in a very gendered world, and I don't mean that in any way that one gender is disparaged by the other, or there's no equity between the genders, when actually what it is, it's egalitarian, meaning everyone's equal, right? So even though a man might be physically stronger than a woman, a man would never overpower a woman. But that is a perfect world. Anyways, Tashi is embracing those elements of Mother Earth, her own womanhood, the gift of corn, and she uses all natural paints. She used an image of herself when she was pregnant with one of her children, and she actually uses corn husk. And what you can't tell, if you can zoom in at another time, at the center of the image, she uses, I believe, copper or gold. I can't remember right offhand. So the last thing that the museum does, and this was always one of the primers for the Seneca Nation to make this new facility. So for a long time, well, in 1990, the United States created a law, and this law was called the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act of 1990. And this law, Native communities work with institutions that have received federal funding to facilitate the return of their cultural items that have been held in museums ever since museums have come into existence in this country. However, very early on in the process, a lot of institutions were able to kind of shuffle their feet a little bit and not return objects. And one of the more common excuses that these institutions would use is they would use this hegemonic view that they were the custodians of the world. They're the only ones with the proper training, with the proper facility to ensure that these objects survive for the enjoyment of all peoples. Well, we have some issues with that. One, first of all, what gives you the right to assume that someone else's cultural heritage also belongs to you? And this is an ongoing issue in the United States. It's just part of that paternalistic mindset of the West at times. And I don't mean it in a negative way. I just mean it in a way that it's a paternalistic culture. And it is. It's getting better. It's not always that way. I believe our younger generation is much different than our older generations. And so we continue to see change. Also within our own Seneca communities, we also see change. It's not as matrilineal as it used to be. So back to repatriation. So with repatriation, these museums would use that excuse. You don't have the proper facility to take care of this object. So as a result, we will hold on to this object until there's a point where you can take care of this. Well, guess what? With this facility, we are able to take care of any Seneca object. We can pretty much care for any Seneca object. and it belongs with the Seneca people, especially if the objects have been deemed to be of Seneca origin. They belong with the community. And so, in my role of director, I have been facilitating several repatriation efforts. So even in COVID right now, I'm working on about 5 repatriations. The pipe that you see here, if you recall Chief Corn Planter was probably the most important historical chief among the Seneca and probably the Haudenosaunee in recorded history. So in the last 450 something years of Western Europeans being in North America, Corn Planter really does stand out as being one of the more important chiefs of that moment. And this moment of his importance came in right at the birth of the United States. And what a lot of people don't realize about the United States is at its birth, it was deeply in debt. It had no money. It had no way to pay for its war debt, to pay for its veterans, to pay for government. And so very quickly, the United States was also dealing with what they call hostile Indian tribes. They weren't hostile. What they were doing is standing up for their sovereign rights to be governed by themselves and by their own communities, by the wishes that they had, and not by the imperialistic drivers of the United States who had this idea of manifest destiny even before the country came into being. I mean, New York State in itself is an idea of manifest destiny, because at the end of the Revolutionary War, New York State was basically still on the east side of the Great Lakes. Anyways, at the end of the American Revolution, the United States has a young government. It almost died. And the founding fathers wisely and very correctly reinitiated a customary diplomacy that was practiced among the British Empire and all native nations that the British Empire touched. And we call it forest diplomacy, where it's a blending of traditional native diplomacy with European style diplomacy, and it merged here in the Americas, and we call it forest diplomacy. And so Washington, being so wise, decided not to get into another Indian war in the Ohio River Valley. He sought to make sure that the Haudenosaunee remained neutral during this war. And so as a result, he did a treaty on November 11th, 1794, in where he negotiated with Chief Corn Planter and many other chiefs of the Seneca and the other Haudenosaunee communities not to fall into war, but to remain brothers with the United States. And as a result, George Washington gave Chief Corn Planter this pipe tomahawk that you see. This pipe tomahawk remained with Chief Corn Planter up until the last 2 years of his life. At that point, he gave up his chieftainship to Chief Snow. Upon that time, Chief Snow also took the tomahawk into his possession as a symbol and an emblem of his chieftainship, as he inherited from. After Chief Snow, it went to Corn Planter's nephew, who also became chief, Ely Parker. Some of you guys might know who Ely Parker was. He was the general for USS Grant, who wrote the terms of surrender for the South at the end of the American Civil War. Ely Parker is also responsible for jump-starting American anthropology with a non-native lawyer in New York State by the name of Lewis Henry Morgan. And so after Ely Parker had the pipe tomahawk, he was helping his community fight to preserve their territory on Tonawanda. And so he sold the pipe tomahawk to the New York State Museum to pay for a trip to D.C. to try to get a word in with President Fillmore. New York State held on to the pipe tomahawk, and then one of its employees stole the tomahawk. It went on the black market, and it shuffled around on the black market for about 70 years. And then finally in like 2007, a collector out west bought the tomahawk for $50,000 on a legal auction. I think he showed it off some, and when he passed, his wife knew where the tomahawk came from, and she offered it back. It went back to the New York State Museum. As soon as we found out that the New York State Museum had this tomahawk, we did a NAGPRA claim in which we were able to get the tomahawk back. It took about 90 days. It is now in the museum. And so we're working on other objects of cultural patrimony. These are objects that really, speak about Seneca culture and their place in history. And so we really feel that these objects should be back at the museum, and we're doing all these extra efforts. I think it's working out. Hopefully, this will become the norm, and then the conversation changes across the country. Because when it becomes normal in one part of the world, you got other researchers looking in and learning. And so this kind of stuff just diffuses. And this is how repatriation has changed in the last 30 years. All it started was one community and one museum going into a discussion. You had people eavesdropping in, they learned, and they tried it for themselves. And then over time, the language of NAGPRA is very alive because there's lots of interpretations how objects are categorized within that law. So what was deemed not to be an object of cultural patrimony 20 years ago probably will be now, because we have really thought about our objects and how they're sacred to us and how they're important, and we are changing that dialogue. 20 years ago, more than likely, we would not be able to get this pipe tomahawk back from the State Museum because of that tenuous relationship after Parker sold it back to the State Museum. Another picture of the pipe tomahawk. The original pipe the axe head is still here. However, the handle that you see was damaged at one point, and Ely fixed it. So this handle that we see on the pipe tomahawk was probably done about 1845. It is still a very beautiful object. Whenever people come to the museum, that's one of the first things they want to see. They want to see it. When we have dignitaries come, they always ask, can I touch it? I don't really try to let too many people touch it. However, there's always a guest or two who you just got to let touch it. So we do, with gloves. So I wasn't going to talk about this one, but I think I'm going to. So Red Jacket. Red Jacket was the nephew of Corn Planter. They were both chiefs. They were contemporary chiefs. Although Red Jacket at the time was probably 25 years younger than Corn Planter, they were both chiefs. They're both American Revolutionary War veterans. They both fought for the British. They both are veterans of the American War of 1812. He's a revered chief. So he was also part of the negotiations of the 1794 treaty. The negotiations took place in 1792, and for his role in those negotiations, George Washington commissioned a peace medal to be given to Red Jacket. And if you look at the peace medal here, what we have is George Washington on the right passing the peace pipe to Red Jacket, who is symbolized as the native person next to him. This object currently is being held at a local museum, and last week we submitted our NAGPRA letter to them with a reason why this object should be returned to us. We think it's actually a no-brainer. Before we submitted the letter, I began discussions with that museum director and long-term curator, and we went through that history together, and we discussed why that piece metal belongs back at Seneca Nation. And, by the end of the discussion, the museum director, her curator, and the board actually voted to return it. And so we are using NAGPRA as a formality to ensure that there are no other claimants to the object. And claimants have 90 days. Once our request has been posted on the Federal Register, there's 90 days that any community, individual, blood-related can claim the object for themselves or himself or herself. And so we just have to wait it out at this point. Hopefully there will be no other claims, and hopefully by April, it will be back in our museum. So I'm going to talk about my last part of my job, Tribal Historic Preservation Office, TIPO. So we do a lot of Section 106 consultations. Section 106 is part of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, which says inside that on any federal lands or federal permits, there has to be consultation with Aboriginal and Native communities of that area. And so let's use Western New York as an example. Let's use Chautauqua County as an example. So next year in Chautauqua County, there is a solar project slated to be built probably about 15 minutes away from the Institute. And what happens is that the company comes in, they do their, and based on those permits, it gets funneled over to the state SHPO office in this case, and the state SHPO notifies all descendant communities from that area that there's going to be development occurring at this site. Are there any cultural resources, sacred landscapes, burials, cemeteries, village sites that we should know about or that we should inform them about? And so we go through this consultation process. If we do know of cultural properties or cultural resources, or they're uncovered during the investigation, we go into a situation where we try to mitigate the effects on those cultural properties. Sometimes it works, sometimes it don't. It's really a toss-up, and it becomes very difficult not to be invested because lots of times we're starting to learn that these companies are building on top of cemeteries and sacred sites. And so by the time that we are pulled into the conversation, you have a company who's already invested hundreds of thousands of dollars and sometimes millions of dollars, and they don't want to back out. And so I've been really trying to encourage the state of New York to put Native consultation at the forefront as soon as they do the permit, so there's not a large investment in case we come back and say, please don't build here because this is a cemetery. And you wouldn't believe it, but it happens a lot. So, this example that I've given you is almost a weekly occurrence. We also deal with things like talking to schools about stereotypes, sports mascots. Native people deal with lots of types of stereotypes. You've seen them on the sports teams. You've seen them on the types of humor that people use in sitcoms. You see it in the language that people use. Let's powwow. I'm the low man on the totem pole, blah, blah, blah. You get it. We also do a lot of reconciliation. So in terms where I'm starting to see a lot of smaller communities like towns and cities who are actively trying to take on forms of reconciliation with their Native neighbors. And so reconciliation can take a lot of forms. Sometimes it's a community project together. Sometimes it's an official policy, apology. It can really vary, right? But if I really feel that the community is sincere about changing something, I do my best to work with them and make sure that it happens. And yeah, it's usually a good thing. I usually create new partners out of this, new friends, and I really appreciate it. And for me, it kind of heals my heart too, because, I carry my own struggles with me, and some of my own struggles stem back hundreds of years because they remain unresolved. And so for me, these are also tiny moments of reconciliation where I let go of hurt feelings or hatred or anger. I wouldn't say hatred, but we do hold on to anger, and sometimes anger can become hatred. But reconciliation is good for everyone. I also have IRBs here. So what IRBs are internal review boards. So certain types of institutions, mostly academic institutions, they try to put in rigors within the review process to ensure that their researchers do not harm any human beings or any living beings. And so there's a review process, and where there's Native people involved, I usually get a call or two if I want to be on a committee with someone, because I do have university affiliations. I also work on archives, a lot of paper. Yes, I deal with a lot of paper. As you know, I kind of started doing this with TIPO, and this is where COVID comes in. So when COVID hit us, as we all know, none of us had in-person activity for the last 9 months, basically, right? And if we have been having any in-person activity in the last 4 or 5 months, it's been really limited, and there's lots of barriers in our ways, right? So with the Cultural Center, TIPO, and the museum, I lost my revenue stream called visitors. Normally, we get about 15,000 visitors a year at the museum, and I can tell you that I've barely had a couple hundred. And so we are looking for ways to create new revenue streams. We have moved into virtual programming, and one of the things that we have started to do with local professionals like social workers, teachers, principals, school administrators, is that we have started doing trauma-based and cultural sensitivity, make people aware of the Seneca Nation. This is one of the reasons why I'm doing this talk today, because a lot of people who live in Southern New York, they don't realize that there's this 8,000 member Native nation that lives in their midst, and they're actually like the fifth largest employer in Western New York. And they've been so influential in New York State and American politics and history for so long that people don't realize that they're there and they're invisible. So what we do is try to make the Seneca and the other Haudenosaunee more visible to the outside world. CBOs, I work with community-based organizations. I work with research repositories. I also work on Native-centric pedagogies. So I am working on a elementary school in Niagara County. We have one in the works for Cattaraugus County, and pedagogies. We also spend a lot of time doing roadside signs lately, placards in parks that have something to do with Seneca or Haudenosaunee. If you read some of that language in the next couple of years in Western New York or in the Pittsburgh area, it might be coming from me. Never know. I also do a lot of archaeology. One thing that I didn't say about myself in my introduction is that I also worked as an archaeologist for about 5 years when I was an undergrad. I'm very interested in archaeology, but I'm a non-digging archaeologist. And the reason why I'm a non-digging archaeologist is because we have a firm belief once our ancestors or our people die and they go into the earth, that's where they should stay. And so archaeology has become this great conflict with us because, we have a group of people who care for culture and history, but at the same time, they've been contracted to remove that history from the earth because they're going to make a mall. And this is happening right now in southern Pittsburgh, where I am working with a development company because they're genuinely good people, and they want to do good, but they also have an investment. And so I'm working with them, and we're creating language about this site that they're building on. And so reluctantly, I have to engage archaeology all the time. Even though I like it, I would never dig, and I don't read interpretation. What I do is I focus on the list of items that they're pulling out of the earth. And I try to find pictures and images of these things so I can put them into my own database here. We also do a lot of language. We do a lot of language translation. And we do a lot of history. Genealogy, I put genealogy, DNA studies here. So we do have members in the community who do a lot of traditional genealogy with family trees and all the symbols. We have that going on. But as Native people, we're encountering this new wall and this DNA studies with companies like 23andMe. They're not the most ethical out there. They are for profit. And so we do think that some of their ethics are a little skewed, and how they advertise selling DNA tests and those results and what that means and who you are as a person is of great importance to us, because it really factors into our voice. It's really difficult to hear someone when you have lived your whole life as a Native person and you had to live through all those struggles and traumas and obstacles to get where you're at, and all of a sudden you meet this light skin or black skin person who says, I'm 1/64th Cherokee, and they claim to be like you, and they obviously don't actually have any understanding of who you are, where you're from, and what makes up your identity. And so it's very conflicting, but I also try to use my role to make people understand that you can't simply take a DNA test and learn that you're 1/64th Cherokee. I also do the NAGPRA and repatriation within the TIPO office, but it's not quite like the museum type of repatriation. It's a little bit more difficult to talk about, and I'm not going to get into it in this conversation because it's too much. And then let's move on to TCPs, traditional cultural properties. And so these properties can be something like the Genesee River, Canandaigua Lake, an earthen mound made by our ancestors. It could be a building. It could be a grassy knoll. It could be any number of things that has a spiritual significance for us. And so I spend a lot of various departments within New York State and federal agencies to change names of things, or to get an acknowledgement that these places are very sacred to Native peoples. Because if we can get a TCP designation, it makes it easier down the road to protect those places from development, and I don't have to get into the struggles that I currently have. And then lastly, what I think I do a lot with folks is I mentor. I mentor everyone. I have a couple PhD students who call upon me for help all the time. I have people reaching out in agencies who need to know more about Native communities, how to approach Native communities, how to go about it correctly and properly without insulting the community. I am working with a high school person right now in the north part of Pittsburgh. Her school happened to be named after the Seneca, and so for her senior thesis, she reached out to me, and she is working on this great project. I'm very excited to see it. And then, last week she asked if I could come to and speak to her class. Normally, I don't jump into my vehicle and drive to Pittsburgh to talk to a high school class. You know what? I will talk about NAGPRA and repatriation in this context, okay? So there's a suburb of Pittsburgh, and in 1897, The Peabody Museum came in and they excavated the mound that was located in this town. They found 33 human beings inside the mound. They packed up the human beings and they sent them to the Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh, where they remain sitting in boxes for the last 123 years. In 2018, Seneca Nation made a claim on those human beings. And at the beginning of this year, those humans were returned to us. We actually never touched them. They're still sitting in the Carnegie. And the reason why they're sitting in the Carnegie is because Seneca Nation and the town where the remains were dug out, we actually figured out a repatriation situation where they're going to allow us to rebury those 33 people in almost the exact same spot where they were dug out. And that becomes very important for our deceased, because when we're in the earth, there's a very tenuous thread that connects your remains in the earth up to the sky world. And so if at any time your burial goods or parts of your body are moved or disturbed out of place, that could ruin the thread that links you to your spiritual self, to your human self, to your physical self. And so it becomes very important for me to make sure that my ancestors are reburied as close as possible to their original interment. And so that's the kind of repatriation that I do. So in New York State, I know it doesn't sound like art, but it really does involve everything that I do at the museum. Archaeology is so important. It goes all the way back to that pot that I showed you at the beginning of this talk, right? So in New York State, archaeology really keeps me busy. We have CRM, which is cultural resource management. That is archaeology in a corporate sense. So if there's any development, most of the time the development corporation will hire a CRM firm to make sure that there's no archaeological cultural resources or historic properties within the area where they wish to build. I do a lot of work on the nation, but I do most of my work outside of the nation, working with these outside entities. We also have an issue with clean energy right now, because clean energy is the hope for the future. There's one governor in particular who wishes to really sell clean energy. And so what he's doing is kind of just pushing his way through all the current legislation to make sure that these projects take place. And, you know, because I'm involved in this type of work, I quickly learned that clean energy is really not that clean. It has a lot of baggage. It uses natural gas to start up wind turbines. The chemicals used to make solar panels. Like, I'm not trying to, make anyone feel like no hope for clean energy. Don't get me wrong, but clean energy is not as clean as it comes, and sometimes clean energy doesn't play very clean in terms of CRM. I also have to work with older existing projects. And then I have to work with the repositories that hold human remains in those objects, kind of like Carnegie. And because of Seneca Nation was such a large empire for about 130 years or so, not only do I have to work with New York State, I have to work with Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia, I forgot to put that in, and with any federal agency that is working within the span of that Aboriginal territory. And then another thing that I do, and this is the slow, tedious part of my job is to make sure that Native people are seen and not erased, and that we have words and terminology that fit us and not imposed on us. And so that's one of the downsides about archaeology. They use their own terminology. And a lot of lay people outside of archaeology assume that these are very real terms, and they're not. And what they do is create a disconnect between my ancestors and our present peoples. And so I try to change that. So this is probably one of the more important places where my anthropological toolbox becomes important. I'm an anthropologist, and so when I go and meet representatives from government agencies, development, what I try to do is, as quickly as possible, is to develop a rapport with these folks, and then try to convince them why we should preserve Indigenous peoples' cultures, territories, and their place in history, and their modern sense of sovereignty on who they are and where they belong in this world. And I try to make spaces where people have a voice. Even in those situations where the nation might lose out on a development project, we do make change. We do change attitudes. And when the next one happens, it's a little bit easier on us. And so I also work with a lot of other Native nations. I work with the Tuscarora Indian Nation. I work with the other Seneca community. I work within the Seneca community. And then with the larger Haudenosaunee, I work with their standing committee on burials and repatriations, because we have human remains and their objects in repositories and museums all across this country, and we have them overseas. Right now, we are in beginning talks with 2 British museums and a French museum who hold Seneca objects. But I also have to work with other nations who might exist but no longer inhabit New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio. A lot of these communities live in Canada or in Oklahoma at this point, because, as you all know, this idea of manifest destiny, and Andrew Jackson in 1832, who wanted to remove all native people east of the Mississippi to Oklahoma, well, he was almost successful, except for in New York State, where we refused to move. And so this is the last part of my slide that I want to talk about, because I am in foreign territory now, just like most of you. With the onset of COVID on March 13th, the president sent everyone home. The president of Seneca Nation sent everyone home, except for directors and other essential staff. So as a result, on March 13th, my staff of 16 went on furlough, and it was just me at the museum by myself. It was very surreal. It's a very large building, 32,000 square feet. And I would be the only person in there. And I was the only person in there until mid-July. And that's when I got my first person back. He came back, and we started cleaning up the museum. We started going through and started recompiling stuff. We started going through our collections. We started going through our store. We did a lot of inventories. We unpacked more. You know, after 2 years and having over 100,000 items, you never finish unpacking. It's just this fact. I am still unpacking. Today I went into the collections and I looked for another box just to unpack it. I still got a ton of boxes. So I have limited staff. So starting Monday, I actually have 2 more people back. So since March, I have slowly made my way back up to 3 people. When will I get the other people back? We don't know. Actually, we don't know anything about our future. As we all know, the number of cases are going up. It seems like every day the United States is breaking a new record in the number of cases. As of right now, I've been reassured that we are moving forward. As a museum, we will be open on Monday. However, I had to make a difficult choice yesterday, and I canceled our winter market. So Hayden, the guy who came back first in July, him and I, we spent hours inside the museum to make sure that we can create a COVID-safe environment. We worked out walkways. We worked out the flow where people can come through. We made sure there was plenty of spaces for people to navigate through, hand sanitizers throughout, places for older people to rest. We had it all worked out, but we started looking at community responses to recent COVID. positives. And with the number of cases happening in our county, we made the most difficult choice not to have a physical winter art market this weekend. And I'm so disappointed. But at the same time, I'm not disappointed because we have to think about our communities and our elders and our young people. And we just can't let it happen. I hope we can create another venue where this will happen. We're obviously going to make it go online and become virtual, but we're just not sure how we're going to do it yet. We're working with one of our organizers, and I think we have something planned, but we'll know by the end of the week how we're going to make this happen. We had to change the focus of our work, even though we only do private tours right now because Hayden and I cannot be at the front door when anyone walks in because we have our offices elsewhere and we do other types of work as well. So we just can't be waiting at the door for a visitor. So we do appointments. We do a lot of Facebook promotion at this point. We do a lot of Zoom. We're starting to do, during the summer, I would go into the collections and pull out some objects, and I would talk about them for 3 to 5 minutes and do these little videos. They were pretty good. I did 2 myself. I averaged about 6,000 hits. And then I would have some of my staff come in and volunteer and talk about their roles or talk about exhibits in the museum. And so, they've been pretty successful, but we think for the winter, we're going to transition to do more arts and crafts classes. So what we'll do is sell people class packages, and we will send them all the supplies, and we will send them video links to the live classes, or we will send them links to the recorded classes so they can learn this skill, this craft. And then the first 2 we're going to do is corn husk doll making and soapstone carving. So we're going to make pipes. Hippo has picked up because of COVID-19. In the last 4 years, Trump's administration has rolled back about 99 environmental friendly policies that many of them involve Native communities. And so as a result, this summer with the lockdown, I started seeing a high number of requests for consultations coming in through my email and snail mail. And very quickly, what I noticed was these easing regulations have caused a stampede of energy development in the eastern United States. I'm sure it's happening everywhere, but I really see it in the East. And then, like I said earlier, the Cultural Center has, we're starting to do cultural sensitivity trainings, and we talk about trauma and how those things might be playing out in modern day people. So that's basically the Seneca Nation and who I am. The next time you're in Southern New York, please come and stop by and see your neighbors. Come and meet us. Come and take a tour of the museum. If you tell me that you're a part of the Chautauqua institution, I will give you a very special tour. And not only will I take you through the museum, I will take you down into the collections where you will see tons and tons of beautiful art pieces spanning the course of time. Anyways, I want to thank the Chautauqua Institution. I want to thank Sharon Loudon. I want to thank Chip. Thank you for having me. Thanks for the exposure. I really appreciate it. I was really disappointed that I wasn't able to come and teach this summer. That was something I was really hoping for. I was really excited. I started working on lesson plans and the stuff I was going to talk about during my time there. Hopefully we will have that opportunity this next coming year. At this time, I'm open for questions. If you don't want to ask your question now, you can always get my contact information from Sharon Loudon, and you can email me, okay? Yahweh, thank you for allowing me time.
Okay, so we are, let's see, can you hear me there?
Yes.
I hope you can hear me. Great. Thank you so much. That was incredible, actually. I mean, it was, anyway, it was tremendous. And we already have a lot of questions that are in the chat. So for everyone who wants to ask a question, you can do a few things. You can just click on to, I'm doing this, click on to your camera, and what will happen is if you click onto your camera, you can come up to on the screen with us and ask a question, or you could just ask a question on the chat, in the chat room, in the chat section. And I already have a couple questions from the chat section that we can ask Dr. Stahlman, and I affectionately call him Joe. So Chip, if you can bring us up there to the main stage, there he is.
Hello.
I mean, it was really tremendous. I learned so much. I feel I don't know how you have time for yourself, and I know that you enjoy stone carving, right? You have mentioned that to me previously. Mm-hmm. So I definitely want to talk about that here, but I owe it to the listeners and the people who are here who are chomping at the bit to ask questions. And there is a gentleman named Daniel Smith who asked, could you discuss the fur trade and its evolution and demise? That's our first question. Thank you, Daniel.
Daniel, I cannot. That's too long.
What? It's too much.
That is a really long. That's a lot, Daniel. So the fur trade, you know, as soon as Europeans got here, there was a need for fur. They really replenished fur-bearing animals in Europe, and when they came here, the place was just full of fur. And so that's part of the reason why the Seneca were so powerful, because they got in on that fur trade very early on. And they knew the power of beaver. And that's part of the reason why the Seneca were able to so quickly to, it wasn't so much territorial control over the Ohio River Valley. It was more like hegemonic control, where they made local chiefs provide tribute to the Seneca. And usually that tribute was fur, which they traded to the Europeans for guns, knives, pots, clothing, colors, beads, whatever. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. We have another question from Art Leopold, who commented and said, wonderful retelling of the true indigenous people's history. As most history is retold by the oppressor, ... school taught history is often biased and wrong. How are you retelling history to set the truth and correct the distortion?
So I do a lot of talks at school, Sharon, and one of the first things that I do with these talks is that I go in and tell them that social studies is actually not history, it's nationalism. You are taught to be an American in these social studies classes. And a lot of usually white Americans, they don't want to hear that. They think that they're hearing this very unbiased view of history and how America can't do any wrong. And it's unfortunate that I have to use history just to give them examples of the injustices towards Native people. And it's still ongoing. We were just talking about this before, the talk happened about, the pipeline, right? It's nonstop.
Right. Yeah.
So I talk and talk, yeah.
I'm so grateful. And you had actually shared that in your talk too, all of the ways in which you do that, in so many different ways. So we have another question from Heather Nemec, and forgive me, Heather, if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. She asked, international border travel seems to have depleted cultural engagement. How do you see the museum making an impact on this dilemma?
I don't.
Oh.
right now, my concern is to keep the museum in the public eye as much as possible.
Yeah.
I'm giving away content at this point, and I don't care. We built this museum, 2 years ago, and we expected to see a turnaround or an increase in traffic, and we're not seeing it because of this ongoing thing. And as a Haudenosaunee person, we're supposed to have free travel across that border because that border we did not cross the border crossed us. And that's our saying. And so for the longest time, we were able just to show our tribal ID cards and get across the Canadian border without a passport. And because of COVID, everybody's locked down. So a lot of us can't even see our relatives right on the other side in Hamilton or in Niagara Falls, Canada. So the lockdown has really affected us in a lot of ways. And even one of my best corn husk doll makers lives on 6 nations in Canada, and she can't even come down to bring her stuff to us. Yeah, so it's really just everything. So, we can't make that impact, but what I can do is keep the museum alive. And so that's what I'm doing. That's the fight I can do at this time.
I think that's significant impact. And I do believe in times such as this, small steps are the best. They're better than none. And so to me, small steps add up a lot. And they still create the journey. I really believe that. Daniel Smith just commented following the question I asked earlier, and he says, I feel like I just learned so much of the Seneca's history and such a wonderful presentation. Thank you, Dr. Joe. It's nice.
Thank you.
So while we're waiting for more questions, I have many. So I want to go back to you. I felt what I wanted to do is just jump through the screen and just hug you so much. I want to do that anyway. But mostly also because you do so much for others. I want to ask you, what do you do for yourself for self-care? Because during this time, it's such a important time not to I think personally not to lose sight of yourself. Any thoughts on how you're doing that for yourself as an example for other leaders in other communities?
Okay, Sharon, I don't know if you know this about me, but I teach Hatha and Vinyasa yoga, and I also teach meditation. And so what I do for myself is I have a lot of practice, a lot of self-discipline and practice that I try to employ at the beginning and end of my day, not just yogic or Eastern philosophies, but I also incorporate my own prayers, well wishes for the world. I send energy out. Whenever I do something that requires a lot of energy of myself, I try to dedicate it to someone or to something. And so for this year, I dedicate all my efforts to everybody because we all need it, Sharon. But for me, it's the breath. Okay, breathing is so crucial. As I studied spiritual groups and religious movements and paths to like certain types of enlightenment, there's a commonality in a lot of these practices, Sharon. And one of the things that I see that a lot of people don't discuss is the breath. It's the power of breath, because with our breath, we can do a lot of things, right? And another thing that we have to realize is this pandemic makes us realize how powerless we are. We cannot stop this virus unless we all do it together, right? And so we also have a lot of stresses. Are we going to lose our jobs? Is the economy going to collapse? Am I going to get sick? Will my kids be able to go to school again? And I don't have any control over any of that. But what I do have control over is my breath. And so whenever I'm in a tight spot and I feel the walls crowding in on me, if I can't walk away and take my own private moment, I just kind of sit there and just breathe through my nose. Let that breath take over, because once I have control of my breath, I actually have more control over those other things that I didn't have control over before. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's what I do.
You did, certainly. And so I have a couple more questions. Shari Flores is one of our amazing alum from 2019, and she also now works with us because we often hire alumni. And she's referencing a saying that I've forgotten what we had said, but she said that's a saying for us down here too. She's in the Rio Grande, US-Mexico border. And she says, thank you so much for an informative lecture. Daniel Smith has written again, and he's said, is there a posted schedule of when the museum is open? I'd imagine that that's on your website. Is that correct?
Yes. It should be posted by the end of the week. We're just making sure that the numbers don't increase too high. Otherwise, we might have to put a pause on them. So before the end of the weekend, you go to the website, you will see Monday through Friday, 10 to 4, the museum will be open.
Thank you. Heather Nemec is back again, and which I'm really grateful for. She asked, what do you think of Karl May and the stories of Winnetou?
It's fiction. I like Karl May. I do. It's silly. I can't get insulted by that. It's more insulting to watch teams with like the Redskins on it or the Braves.
Yeah.
It's fiction. We can all sit and look at a movie. I was watching a movie once with a firefighter, and he told me, we don't put out fires like that. Well, guess what? Indians don't live like that in movies and blah, 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 right? It's fiction. It's supposed to be an enjoyment. So I don't get offended by it. And if anything, you know what Karl May has done? He has kept Native Americans very much alive in Western Europe. Man, there are thousands of Germans and Czechs and Austrians and Italians and French people who love Native American culture, and they go out of their way to make sure that these objects that they create or reenact are authentic. And that they do more than I've seen here in the States, Well,
that's wonderful. Just a few more questions before we end our evening together. Erica Diamond, who is an artist and also the assistant director of our galleries, which we still are working, I think, right now. I believe Judy is trying to be in contact with you as far as having some of opportunities for some of the artisans in Seneca Nation. So from Seneca Nation. So Erica asked, do you feel you have, you don't feel you have to answer all. Do you offer museum memberships as a way to help support all you do? If you do, sign me up. Also, I'm thrilled to hear about the upcoming beadwork exhibition. Can you speak more about that show? Knowing that you represent the Haudenosaunee as a whole, will Oneida beadwork be represented in this exhibition? And then I have another question after that.
So yes, what we'll do is go through the history of beadwork, obviously. So we used a lot of shell beads. Remember my talk last year where I was talking about the wampum belts and how they're hypertext? So that we made, we did make our own beads, right? But they were obviously much larger and not as small as European trade beads. And so we go through that history. We start off with wampum. We go into the quill work. Remember the porcupine quills I talked about? Yeah, we go through those processes. Yeah. And then we'll talk about and show the history of Haudenosaunee beadwork. We do 3D beadwork. We do flat beadwork. We do lines, floral, objects from the world. And so each community has their style of beadwork. Sometimes it bleeds over and sometimes it changes, like I've showed throughout the talk, but we're just going to kind of show it all at once. We have so much stuff. Like, you have no idea how much beadwork we have. We have more beadwork than anything else in that museum.
I'm really excited by that. And Erica asked, what can the Chautauqua community do to help your community during this difficult time?
Well, The one thing that I didn't talk about in this talk, Sharon, is the program that I got jump started. So the Southern Tier, or Western New York, we're on this weird boundary where we're kind of two regions in one. Tourism really suffers in Southern New York. It really does, especially in the area like Allegheny. Allegheny State Park gets 1.1 million visitors a year, but none of those visitors stick around in the area and hang out. And so for the last couple of years, we have been really trying to pull those visitors in who come to the state park, and we're not doing it. And we're also not pulling in visitors who come into the museum. I mean, not the museum, the casino, right? Because we're quickly finding out those people are only there to spend their money at the casino, and they don't want to see anything cultural. So I decided to jumpstart a tourism project and start off with Seneca Nation, but I'm hoping to include everybody and anybody who's interested in turning our region into a destination. As you know, it's a very beautiful place. A lot of people don't realize how rural and mountainous Southern New York is. They have this, it looks like Queens in people's minds when it doesn't, right? It's very rural. And so I think there's lots of things in this area that will attract people. And I'm hoping Chautauqua Institution will be a partner.
Oh, we're all about that. Of course.
We're not looking for money. We're looking for experience. We're looking for people with skill sets, people who can help start this initiative. Because a lot of Seneca people, they're great artists, but they know nothing about running a business. They know nothing about selling or haggling. There's been situations where I've gone into a powwow. There's someone that I know, and I know they're a great artist, and they give away their work because they think they're not going to get a fair price for it, for their labor and for their talents. Right. And I want to change that.
Well, we're available for that mentoring, as we talked about before, and I'm really grateful for any exchange that we have. So the last question for this evening is actually from Vincent Valega, my husband, and he said, can you ask Joe about his thoughts regarding the Supreme Court ruling in June that much of eastern Oklahoma belongs to Muskogee Creek Nation? What are your thoughts about that? That was really incredible, actually. Or not?
We're looking. So I'm a historian as well as an anthropologist, right? And so there's a treaty, it's the Treaty of 1826 that happened at Buffalo Creek. That treaty was never ratified by the United States. So treaties are the supreme law of the land according to the United States Constitution. And this treaty was never ratified by the Congress. It was a tiebreaker vote. It was 10 states versus 10 states. The Vice President, John Calhoun, was supposed to come and do the tiebreaker vote, and he didn't show up that day, so they're ratified. And then on the Seneca side, they never had consensus because we don't do 51% as majority. What we do is 100% consensus, and there wasn't consensus, so they threw out the treaty. However, the negotiators for the treaty went ahead and didn't tell any of the Seneca and moved them out. Wow. Looking into that, based on the McGurk case in Oklahoma.
That's amazing. Yeah. Woo! Wow, you are incredible. You know what?
So this is happening. Tell your husband this is happening with lots of tribes right now because they're all going through their paperwork. Not just Seneca, right? It's everyone. Like even my own community of the Tuscarora were chased out of North Carolina by squatters and rebel soldiers. And so there's a possibility there. The Passamaquoddy back in the 60s got half of Maine back because that was illegally stolen. So we are starting to see, we're starting to see a sea change. And that's probably the best thing that I've seen this summer is that a lot of people are starting to say, wow, I think America is not that free or that equitable. and people are starting to really question things. Well,
I think that that's a positive. Well, I'm really grateful to you, Joe. Say again?
No, thank you. I just said thank you. I was muffled. Maybe my signal went.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everything. I can't thank you enough. Of course, we're really thrilled, and we really would love to welcome you to Chautauqua next year, depending on what happens with New York State and allowing for us to gather. And we really would love to, on all the many ways that the Chautauqua Visual Arts and you and Seneca Nation and the museum and the center, all of us connecting. So I can't thank you enough for your generosity. You're such a beacon of information and inspiration. And thank you everyone for being here this evening. We have actually we have once a month, Joe, I don't know if you know, but once a month we have a lecture, and I know that Chip's going to put up the next person. And Joe, this person is I don't know if you're familiar, but Derek Forger is an artist who's incredibly just expressive in what he talks about. And he actually started fairly late as an artist, as a professional artist. And I was actually, funny enough, I had taught him a little bit, and I feel really proud of that. That's how I met him. So I think that the other thing is, when you talk about mentorship, it is about community connecting, I feel. And so Derek, just like you, has a lot of goodness and generosity. And so our program, we desire and we strive to bring those people forward. And I'm just so thrilled that no one can follow in your footsteps, but he's a really generous person. So I hope that you and everyone will join us for Derek's talk in about a month. And then I just also want to thank our team and Joe and everyone. I also want to just say that this is part of the open porch, or did I say, is it virtual porch, open porch? I always get that wrong. But everybody's sitting on a porch here, I think, as we do at Chautauqua. And so thank you everyone for being here. And Joe, I'm just the virtual porch, right? I always say open porch, I think, because it's open and want to be as open as possible. But thank you again, Joe. Thanks for everyone being here. I'm sending everyone safety, love, and gratitude. Good night, everyone. Good night. Thanks again.